People like you don't sit here. Those were the words that made the entire first-class cabin fall silent just minutes before Flight 278 from Chicago to New York was scheduled to depart. Marcus Reed had just stepped into the aisle, carrying a slim leather briefcase and wearing a simple navy blazer, dark jeans, and polished brown shoes. He looked calm, composed, and completely unbothered by the rush of boarding passengers around him. As he reached seat 2A, however, he stopped. A blonde woman dressed in an expensive cream-colored designer suit was already seated there, scrolling through her phone while sipping sparkling water. Marcus checked his boarding pass once, then looked up politely. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said with a friendly smile. "I believe you're sitting in my seat." The woman barely looked up. "No, I'm not," she replied flatly. Marcus glanced at the seat number again. "I'm sorry, but this is definitely seat 2A. The woman slowly lowered her sunglasses and looked Marcus up and down. Several nearby passengers immediately sensed tension. "Listen," she said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "I specifically paid for first class because I didn't want any confusion. My seat is right here." Marcus remained calm. "I understand, and I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. Would you mind checking your boarding pass?" Instead of checking, the woman crossed her arms. "Actually, I think you're the one confused." A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A young couple stopped their conversation. Even a flight attendant nearby turned toward them. Marcus maintained his polite tone. "I'd be happy to compare tickets." The woman let out a short laugh. "Unbelievable." She finally stood halfway, pulled a boarding pass from her purse, glanced at it for less than a second, then sat back down. "Nope, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Marcus noticed she had covered most of the ticket with her hand. "May I see the seat number?" he asked. Her expression hardened. "No, you may not." The flight attendant approached with a professional smile. "Is everything all right here?" Before Marcus could answer, the woman spoke first. "Actually, no. This gentleman seems to think he belongs in my seat." A few passengers quietly exchanged looks. Marcus calmly handed over his boarding pass. "I believe there's simply been a mix-up." The attendant examined the ticket. "Mr. Reed, you are assigned to seat 2A. Before she could continue, the woman interrupted. "There has to be some mistake. I've flown first class for years. I know exactly where I belong." Then she looked directly at Marcus and said, loud enough for nearly everyone to hear, "People don't accidentally wander into first class unless they're hoping nobody notices." A heavy silence settled across the cabin as every eye turned toward Marcus, waiting to see what he would do next. Marcus noticed the uncomfortable expressions spreading across the cabin, but his own expression never changed. He simply looked at the flight attendant and said, "I am sure we can clear this up quickly." The attendant, whose name tag read Melissa, offered an apologetic smile. "Of course, sir. Let me just verify everyone's boarding information." Before Melissa could continue, the woman extended her hand. "Victoria Sterling," she said confidently. "I am a Platinum Elite member, and I fly this route almost every week. There is obviously some kind of system error." Melissa politely accepted Victoria's boarding pass and examined it. A slight crease appeared on her forehead. "Ms. Sterling, according to your ticket, your assigned seat is actually 3C. Victoria immediately shook her head. "That is impossible." Melissa turned the boarding pass around and pointed to the printed seat number. "It does say 3C, ma'am." For a brief moment, it seemed the situation might finally end. Instead, Victoria leaned back in the spacious first-class seat and crossed her legs. "Well, I am not moving." Several passengers looked shocked by her response. Melissa blinked. "Excuse me?" Victoria lowered her voice slightly but made certain everyone nearby could still hear. "Look around. There are empty seats in business class. He can sit there. I am already settled." The businessman across the aisle frowned. The young couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. Marcus remained completely composed. "Ms. Sterling, that will not be necessary," he said calmly. "I would simply like the seat I purchased." Victoria gave a short laugh. "You are making this much harder than it needs to be." She gestured dismissively toward the back of the aircraft. There are plenty of seats on this plane. Melissa attempted to maintain her professional tone. Ma'am, airline policy requires passengers to sit in their assigned seats. Victoria sighed dramatically. Do you have any idea how much business I bring to this airline every year? Melissa hesitated. I understand your concern, but… No, Victoria interrupted. You clearly do not. She reached into her designer handbag and produced a black credit card with an exclusive concierge insignia. I spend more on travel in a month than most people spend in a year. A few nearby passengers quietly nodded, apparently impressed. Marcus simply stood beside the seat, his briefcase still in hand. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not even appear irritated. That calmness seemed to frustrate Victoria even more. Why are you just standing there? She asked. Because I believe people reveal a great deal about themselves during moments like this, Marcus answered softly. The comment caused several passengers to look away. Victoria rolled her eyes. Please spare me the lecture. Just then, the captain announced that boarding would conclude in 10 minutes. Melissa looked increasingly anxious. Mr. Reed, if you would allow us a moment, we will resolve this. Marcus nodded. Take your time. As he stepped aside near the galley, whispers immediately began spreading through the first-class cabin, and more than one passenger started wondering why the man being treated unfairly seemed to be the calmest person on the entire aircraft. Melissa quietly stepped into the galley and spoke into her headset, clearly seeking guidance from the lead flight attendant. During those few minutes, Marcus remained standing near the front of the cabin, completely relaxed. He placed his briefcase beside him and looked out the window at the busy runway, as if the entire incident was nothing more than a minor delay in his day. Victoria, meanwhile, appeared increasingly confident. She pulled out her phone, opened a social media application, and began typing. The businessman across the aisle finally leaned toward Marcus. Sir, there is an empty seat in row 4. You could probably take that and avoid all this trouble. Marcus smiled politely. Thank you. I appreciate the suggestion. The man nodded. Sometimes it is easier not to argue. Marcus considered the comment for a moment before replying. Sometimes it is. But sometimes people need the opportunity to make their own decisions. The businessman looked puzzled but said nothing more. A few rows back, a middle-aged woman approached Melissa, who had just returned. Excuse me, she whispered. That gentleman has been nothing but respectful. I hope this gets sorted fairly. Melissa nodded appreciatively. We are working on it. Before she could continue, Victoria called out again. How much longer is this going to take? We are holding up the entire flight. Melissa took a deep breath. Ms. Sterling, I have spoken with my supervisor. You will need to move to your assigned seat. Victoria's face hardened instantly. Absolutely not. Several passengers looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Ma'am, Melissa continued carefully, we cannot depart until all passengers are seated correctly. Victoria shook her head. Then perhaps he should take another seat. Melissa remained professional. Mr. Reed paid for this seat. Victoria let out a dramatic sigh. Fine. If he wants it so badly, he can have it. For the first time, some passengers expected Marcus to step forward and finally sit down. Instead, he surprised everyone. Actually, Marcus said calmly, Miss Sterling may keep the seat. The entire cabin went silent again. Melissa looked stunned. Sir, are you sure? Marcus nodded. Yes, please assign me any available seat. I do not want the crew delayed because of me. Victoria smiled triumphantly. See? Problem solved. She settled deeper into the spacious seat, clearly pleased with herself. Several passengers exchanged uneasy looks. The young woman from the couple near row 2 quietly whispered to her husband. That does not feel right. Her husband agreed. Even Melissa appeared uncomfortable. Mr. Reed, there is an available seat in business class. Marcus picked up his briefcase. That will be perfectly fine. As Melissa escorted him toward the rear of the aircraft, Victoria resumed scrolling through her phone, seemingly satisfied that she had won. But as Marcus passed through the cabin, more than one passenger noticed something unusual. Despite giving up the seat, despite being inconvenienced, despite being publicly embarrassed, Marcus still carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had lost absolutely nothing. As the aircraft door finally closed, Victoria looked noticeably more relaxed. She adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, opened the airline's premium menu, and smiled as if the unpleasant episode had confirmed exactly what she already believed about herself. A flight attendant offered pre-departure beverages, and Victoria requested sparkling water with lemon before immediately lifting her phone again. Seated comfortably in seat 2A, she snapped a photo of the cabin and began typing another social media post. The passenger across the aisle could not help overhearing her. "Travel lesson for today," Victoria said aloud while typing. "Sometimes you have to stand your ground because people will always try to take advantage." The businessman raised an eyebrow but remained silent. A few rows behind first class, Marcus had settled into his new seat without complaint. Although business class offered less space, he appeared perfectly content. He placed his briefcase beneath the seat, accepted a cup of coffee from another flight attendant, and thanked her warmly. "Thank you, Angela. I appreciate your help." The attendant seemed surprised. "You remembered my name?" Marcus smiled. "People appreciate being remembered." Angela smiled back. "I hope the rest of your trip goes much better, Mr. Reed." Marcus simply nodded. Back in first class, Victoria was now engaged in a phone conversation using her wireless headset while passengers continued boarding. "Yes, absolutely," she said confidently. "The board meeting starts at noon sharp. Frankly, I expect major changes. Some executives have become too comfortable." Her voice carried easily through the quiet cabin. "Our company needs stronger leadership and people who understand image, influence, and market perception." She paused and laughed softly. "Trust me, by the end of this quarter, several people will be answering to me." The businessman finally spoke. "You work in corporate leadership?" Victoria smiled proudly. "Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Sterling Dynamics Holdings." Several nearby passengers looked impressed. "We are one of the fastest-growing technology investment groups in the country." She straightened proudly. "I oversee acquisitions, investor relations, and executive restructuring." "That sounds important," another passenger commented. Victoria nodded. "Very important. In fact, this meeting in New York could change the future of the entire company." She glanced briefly toward the rear of the aircraft where Marcus now sat. "Leadership requires difficult decisions. Not everyone belongs in every room." The comment made several passengers uncomfortable, but nobody responded. As the aircraft pushed away from the gate, Victoria continued speaking. "Once our founder fully steps back, everything will change. I have spent years building influence within the company." She smiled confidently. "The future belongs to people willing to take control." Unbeknownst to Victoria, 2 rows behind her, the young couple exchanged uneasy glances. "Does she realize the gentleman never once argued with her?" the wife whispered. Her husband shook his head. "No. And honestly, I do not think she cares." Meanwhile, Marcus quietly opened his laptop. As the aircraft began taxiing toward the runway, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time that morning, a faint smile crossed his face as he read the caller identification. Daniel Foster. Marcus waited until the aircraft reached cruising altitude before returning Daniel Foster's call. He kept his voice low and professional, but in the quiet business class cabin, a few nearby passengers could still hear portions of the conversation. "Good morning, Daniel," Marcus said warmly. "Did everything go smoothly?" Daniel's voice sounded relieved even through the phone. "Mostly, sir. However, the board has requested that the agenda be revised. Ms. Hayes wants the acquisition proposal moved to the first item." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. The investors have been waiting for a final decision." Daniel hesitated. "There is one more thing. Several board members are concerned about the restructuring plan." Marcus smiled faintly. "They usually are. That is why we discuss these matters together." The passenger seated beside Marcus could not help overhearing. He looked up from his tablet with curiosity. Marcus continued, "Has legal completed the review?" "Yes, sir," Daniel replied. "The documents are ready for your signature as soon as you arrive. Also, the transportation team will meet you on the tarmac at Kennedy International Airport. Ms. Hayes specifically asked me to remind you that the entire board will be present." Marcus chuckled softly. "Evelyn never leaves anything to chance." Daniel laughed. "No, she does not. One final question, sir. Would you like me to inform the executive team that you will chair the entire session personally?" Marcus looked out the window for a moment. "Yes, after today's vote, the company needs clarity. Everyone deserves to know exactly where we are headed." Several nearby passengers exchanged glances. This no longer sounded like an ordinary business traveler. The man sitting across the aisle quietly lowered his headphones and listened more carefully. Daniel continued, "Very good, sir. One more update. The market reacted positively to yesterday's announcement. Sterling Dynamics stock opened up nearly 7% this morning." Marcus nodded. "Excellent. That should reassure the smaller shareholders." At the mention of Sterling Dynamics, the businessman across the aisle froze. He knew the company well. It was one of the largest technology investment firms in the country. Before he could process what he had heard, Marcus added, "Please make certain that all department heads attend in person. I do not want anyone absent from today's discussion." "Of course, Mr. Reed," Daniel said immediately. "The board will not begin until you arrive." Marcus thanked him and ended the call. As he placed his phone away, the businessman beside him finally spoke. "Excuse me, sir. Did you say Sterling Dynamics?" Marcus smiled politely. "Yes, I did. That is a very large company." Marcus simply nodded. "It keeps us busy." The businessman waited for more, but Marcus returned to reviewing documents on his laptop. A few rows ahead, Victoria had removed her headset and was now speaking with another passenger. She had not heard the entire conversation, but she had clearly caught one detail. Sterling Dynamics. Her expression changed for just a second. It was the same company where she served as vice president. Still, she quickly dismissed the thought. There was no way the quiet man she had pushed out of first class could possibly have anything important to do with her company. It had to be a coincidence. At least, that was what she told herself. For the next 30 minutes, Victoria tried to focus on preparing for the board meeting waiting for her in New York, but she found herself glancing repeatedly toward business class. The brief conversation she had overheard continued to bother her. Sterling Dynamics was not a small company. It was a multi-billion-dollar enterprise with thousands of employees, dozens of subsidiaries, and a leadership team that rarely changed. Everyone at the executive level knew one another, at least by reputation. Yet she could not remember ever seeing Marcus Reed before. That fact reassured her. If he had truly held an important position, she would certainly know who he was. Still, doubt lingered. Victoria opened her laptop and reviewed the meeting agenda one more time. The document listed several senior executives, board members, and major investors who would be attending. Near the top appeared the familiar name Evelyn Hayes, chairwoman of the board. Victoria respected Evelyn, although she found her intimidating. Rumors had circulated for months that major changes were coming. Some executives believed the founder would soon step away from daily operations. Others expected a complete restructuring. Victoria had spent years positioning herself for greater influence within the company, and today's meeting could determine her future. A flight attendant approached with lunch service. "Chicken or salmon, Miss Sterling?" Victoria selected the salmon, then casually asked, out of curiosity, "Who is the gentleman sitting in business class?" "The one who gave up his seat." The attendant smiled politely. "I am sorry, ma'am. We cannot discuss other passengers." Victoria forced a laugh. "Of course. I was only wondering because he seemed familiar." The attendant simply nodded and moved on. Across the cabin, the businessman who had overheard Marcus's earlier call remained curious. Eventually, he walked toward the lavatory and happened to pass Marcus's seat. "Excuse me, sir," he said quietly. "I hope you do not mind me asking, But, do you work with Sterling Dynamics? Marcus closed his laptop and smiled. In a manner of speaking, the businessman chuckled. That sounds important. Marcus answered with his usual calm. Every person in an organization is important. Companies succeed because people work together. The businessman nodded, impressed by the response. As he returned to first class, he noticed Victoria watching him expectantly. Did you find out who he is? She whispered. Not exactly, the man admitted. But if I were you, I would not underestimate him. Victoria frowned. Why would you say that? The businessman shrugged. Because truly powerful people rarely feel the need to prove anything. Those words unsettled Victoria far more than she wanted to admit. She looked toward business class once more. Marcus was reviewing financial documents, occasionally making notes, completely unconcerned with her attention. For the first time since boarding, Victoria began to wonder whether giving up that seat so easily had not been a defeat at all. Perhaps it had simply been a choice made by someone who had nothing to gain from winning the argument in the first place. Despite her growing uneasiness, Victoria quickly pushed her doubts aside. She had spent too many years climbing the corporate ladder to allow a stranger on an airplane to shake her confidence. By the middle of the flight, she had convinced herself that the entire situation was ridiculous. There were thousands of professionals connected to Sterling Dynamics through vendors, consultants, investors, and outside partners. Marcus could easily be one of them. The explanation seemed perfectly reasonable. Determined to regain her confidence, Victoria resumed speaking with the passengers around her. Corporate life teaches you to read people quickly, she said while sipping coffee. You learn who belongs in executive circles and who does not. The businessman across the aisle looked uncomfortable. I am not sure appearances tell us very much, he replied carefully. Victoria smiled politely, but there was an unmistakable edge in her voice. Trust me, they do. Leadership leaves clues. Confidence, presentation, connections. You can usually tell within 30 seconds. The businessman glanced toward business class. I think that gentleman displayed quite a bit of confidence. Victoria laughed softly. No, he displayed passivity. There is a difference. Several nearby passengers exchanged looks. The young woman seated nearby finally spoke. He seemed respectful to me. Victoria shrugged. Respectful people do not challenge first-class passengers over seating arrangements. The young woman looked surprised. But it was his assigned seat. Victoria dismissed the comment with a wave of her hand. The point is that successful people know when to avoid unnecessary conflict. Ironically, nobody pointed out that Marcus had done exactly that. A short time later, Melissa walked through first class checking on passengers. Victoria stopped her. I would like to file a formal complaint after we land, she announced loudly. Melissa maintained her professional expression. I am sorry to hear that, ma'am. What would you like to address? Victoria straightened in her seat. The handling of the boarding situation was unacceptable. Premium customers should not be placed in uncomfortable situations. Melissa nodded politely. I understand. Victoria continued, making certain nearby passengers could hear. Frankly, your staff should be better trained to recognize these situations before they escalate. Melissa simply thanked her and moved on. As she walked toward business class, she stopped beside Marcus. Mr. Reed, may I offer you anything else? Marcus smiled warmly. No thank you, Melissa. You and your team have been exceptional. Melissa visibly relaxed. Thank you, sir. That means a great deal. Victoria watched the exchange carefully. Once again, something felt strange. Flight attendants rarely appeared so genuinely pleased by routine compliments. More importantly, Melissa seemed almost relieved whenever she spoke with Marcus. A few minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing that they would begin their descent into New York in approximately 45 minutes. Victoria opened her laptop one final time to review the executive roster for the meeting. As she scanned the names, her eyes suddenly stopped. There, listed directly beneath Chairwoman Evelyn Hayes, was a name she had somehow overlooked before. Marcus Reed, Founder and Chief Executive Officer Emeritus. Victoria stared at the screen for several seconds before quickly shaking her head. Could not possibly be the same person. Could it? Victoria read the name again. Marcus Reed, founder and chief executive officer emeritus. She stared at the screen for several long seconds, trying to remember every photograph, every annual report, every investor presentation she had ever seen. The company founder rarely appeared in public. Most employees had never met him. He avoided interviews, delegated media appearances, and had gradually stepped back from day-to-day operations over the past few years. Still, Victoria knew enough to realize that if the man sitting in business class truly was that Marcus Reed, then she had made a catastrophic mistake. She immediately opened the company's internal directory on her laptop, but the aircraft's internet connection had become unstable as they began descending. Frustrated, she closed the screen and looked toward business class again. Marcus was calmly reviewing documents, occasionally making notes with a fountain pen. There was no sign of anger, no sign of resentment, and certainly no indication that he had spent the last several hours thinking about her at all. Somehow that unsettled Victoria even more. The captain soon announced that the aircraft would begin its final descent into John F. Kennedy International Airport. Passengers started organizing their belongings. Melissa and the cabin crew moved through the aisles collecting cups and trays. As Melissa approached Marcus, she quietly said, "Mr. Reed, there is someone waiting at the gate who asked to be informed the moment we landed." Marcus smiled. "Thank you, Melissa. Please let him know there is no need to rush. We will be deplaning soon enough." Melissa nodded respectfully. Victoria heard every word. Someone was waiting specifically for him at the gate. That was unusual. Corporate executives often traveled alone. The businessman across the aisle noticed Victoria's growing anxiety. "Everything all right?" he asked. Victoria forced a smile. "Of course. You seem worried." Victoria hesitated before replying. "I may have recognized the gentleman in business class." The businessman raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. I thought you said earlier that you could always tell who belonged in executive circles." Victoria looked away. "Apparently, I may have been mistaken." The businessman offered a thoughtful smile. "That happens to all of us." As the aircraft touched down smoothly on the runway, a light round of applause came from several passengers. Phones immediately appeared throughout the cabin as people prepared for arrival. The moment the aircraft reached the gate and the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers stood and reached for overhead luggage. Victoria remained seated, unusually quiet. Then something unexpected happened. Before anyone could begin leaving the plane, a sharply dressed man in his 40s entered the aircraft from the jet bridge, accompanied by an airport representative. He looked around the cabin with urgency until his face brightened. "Mr. Reed," he called warmly, loud enough for much of first class to hear. Thank goodness. Chairwoman Hayes was about to send a second car. Every conversation in the cabin instantly stopped. Marcus looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Daniel. I see you are still incapable of relaxing." Daniel laughed. "Sir, the entire board is already assembled. They refused to begin without you." Victoria felt the color drain from her face as every passenger slowly turned to look first at Marcus, and then back at her. The silence inside the cabin felt almost unreal. Only minutes earlier, passengers had been gathering their belongings and preparing to leave. Now, nobody seemed interested in moving. Daniel stepped farther into the aircraft, immediately reaching for Marcus's briefcase. "Please allow me, sir," he said. Marcus smiled and handed it over. "Thank you, Daniel. But you really did not need to come onto the plane." Daniel laughed. Chairwoman Hayes insisted. "The board has been waiting for nearly an hour. Frankly, several directors refused to begin the meeting without you present." Marcus stood and adjusted his blazer. "Then we should not keep them waiting any longer." As Marcus prepared to leave his seat, Victoria suddenly rose from first class and hurried toward the business cabin. Every passenger watched. Melissa paused in the aisle. Even the flight crew seemed curious about what would happen next. Victoria stopped a few feet from Marcus. For the first time since boarding, she appeared genuinely uncertain. "Excuse me, she said carefully. Mr. Reed. Marcus turned politely. Yes. Victoria forced an uneasy smile. I apologize if this sounds strange, but do you happen to work with Sterling Dynamics? Daniel looked surprised. Marcus simply nodded. Yes, I do. Victoria swallowed hard. In what capacity? Several passengers leaned closer, pretending not to listen. Marcus studied Victoria for a brief moment. There was no anger in his expression, only calm curiosity. Why do you ask? Victoria hesitated. Because I am Vice President of Strategic Partnerships. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. He clearly recognized her name. Ms. Sterling? He asked. Victoria nodded. Yes. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Marcus before remaining silent. Victoria suddenly realized that Daniel knew exactly who she was. Her voice became softer. I think there may have been a misunderstanding earlier. The businessman from first class quietly shook his head. Everyone on the plane knew that the incident had been far more than a misunderstanding. Victoria looked directly at Marcus. I was hoping you could tell me your role at the company. The cabin became completely silent once again. Marcus answered in the same calm tone he had used throughout the entire flight. I suppose the simplest answer is that I founded Sterling Dynamics 32 years ago. Victoria stared at him. Before she could respond, Marcus added gently, I also remain the majority shareholder. Victoria's face lost all color. You are the founder? Marcus nodded. Yes. Victoria struggled to speak. But that would mean. Marcus finished the sentence for her. It means that, technically speaking, I own the company you work for. No one said a word. The young couple looked stunned. The businessman lowered his eyes. Melissa quietly covered her mouth in disbelief. Victoria stood frozen in the aisle, suddenly replaying every word she had spoken that morning. Every assumption, every insult, every attempt to dismiss and belittle the quiet man standing before her. And for the first time since boarding the aircraft, Victoria Sterling had absolutely nothing to say. Victoria remained motionless in the aisle as passengers slowly began collecting themselves from the shock. Daniel stepped forward, still holding Marcus's briefcase. Sir, the cars are waiting downstairs. Chairwoman Hayes asked me to remind you that the investment committee presentation has been moved to the beginning of the meeting. Marcus nodded. Thank you, Daniel. Please let Evelyn know we will be there shortly. Daniel smiled. Of course, Mr. Reed. Victoria looked from Daniel to Marcus, desperately trying to understand how she could have been so wrong. I do not understand, she finally whispered. I have worked at Sterling Dynamics for 7 years. I have never met you. Marcus offered a polite smile. That is not unusual. I have intentionally maintained a limited public profile during the past decade. I prefer focusing on long-term strategy rather than public appearances. Victoria shook her head slowly. But everyone says you stepped away from daily operations. I did, Marcus replied calmly. However, I still attend every major board meeting, oversee acquisitions, and remain actively involved in leadership decisions. Daniel added, Mr. Reed still holds controlling interest in the company. Nothing significant moves forward without his approval. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. Earlier that morning, she had confidently told strangers that leadership left clues and that she could identify powerful people within seconds. Now those same passengers were quietly watching her struggle to process the truth. The businessman from first class finally spoke. Looks like there is always more to learn about people. Victoria lowered her eyes. Yes, she said softly. Melissa approached Marcus one last time. Mr. Reed, on behalf of the airline, I would like to apologize again for the inconvenience you experienced today. Marcus smiled warmly. There is no need, Melissa. Your crew handled a difficult situation professionally. Thank you for your kindness. Melissa visibly relaxed. Thank you, sir. Victoria looked genuinely confused. You are not upset? Marcus considered the question. Being upset would not change what happened. But after everything I said, Victoria began. Marcus interrupted gently. People reveal themselves during moments of stress, success, and inconvenience. Today was simply one of those moments. The words landed heavily. Victoria realized that throughout the entire flight, Marcus had never once raised his voice, demanded special treatment, or used his position to intimidate anyone. He had simply observed. As passengers slowly began exiting the aircraft, Daniel leaned closer to Marcus. "Sir, there is one additional item on today's agenda. The board would like to discuss several executive promotions." Victoria heard every word. Her heart immediately began racing. She had been expecting to be considered for expanded leadership responsibilities during that very meeting. Now she could think only about the impression she had just made on the company's founder and majority owner. For the first time in her professional career, Victoria Sterling was genuinely afraid of what awaited her after leaving the plane. The ride from John F. Kennedy International Airport to Sterling Dynamics headquarters felt much longer than usual for Victoria. Although she traveled with other executives in the company's transportation convoy, she barely spoke during the entire trip. Her mind replayed every moment from the flight with painful clarity. She remembered refusing to check her boarding pass, dismissing Marcus's request, and confidently explaining to strangers that she could identify powerful people simply by looking at them. Each memory felt worse than the last. By the time the black sedan pulled into the underground executive entrance beneath Sterling Dynamics Tower in Midtown Manhattan, Victoria felt physically exhausted. As she stepped out of the vehicle, she saw Marcus already entering the building alongside Daniel. Employees throughout the lobby greeted him warmly. Security officers nodded respectfully. Several senior managers immediately approached him with updates. Marcus listened patiently, thanking each person by name. Victoria stood frozen for a moment. During 7 years at the company, she had built her reputation on ambition, results, and influence. Yet she realized that she had rarely witnessed executives speaking to receptionists, security personnel, and junior employees with the genuine warmth Marcus displayed naturally. "Victoria." She turned to see Chairwoman Evelyn Hayes approaching. Evelyn was a distinguished woman in her 60s known for her intelligence and direct communication style. "The board is already assembled," Evelyn said. Then she studied Victoria carefully. "You look unsettled. Is everything all right?" Victoria forced a weak smile. "Long flight." Evelyn nodded but clearly sensed something deeper. "Well, today is important. The promotion recommendations and restructuring proposals will shape the next decade of this company." Victoria felt her stomach tighten again. Inside the executive boardroom, 15 directors and senior leaders had already taken their seats around the long walnut conference table. Conversations immediately stopped when Marcus entered. Every board member stood. "Good morning, Marcus," Evelyn said warmly. "Thank you for joining us." Marcus smiled. "I apologize for the delay." "Nonsense," Evelyn replied. "We were simply waiting for the person who built this company." Victoria quietly took her assigned seat near the end of the table. She noticed that Marcus's chair sat at the head of the room directly beside Evelyn. Daniel distributed updated agendas while the directors reviewed financial reports. Then Evelyn addressed the room. "Before we begin, I would like to discuss leadership appointments." Victoria felt her heartbeat accelerate. She had expected this moment for months. Evelyn continued, "Several candidates have been considered for expanded executive responsibilities. However, leadership at Sterling Dynamics has never been based solely on performance metrics. Character matters equally." Marcus remained silent, reviewing documents. Victoria could not bring herself to look directly at him. For the first time in her career, she realized that promotions, titles, and influence suddenly seemed insignificant compared to one simple question. What kind of person had she revealed herself to be when she believed nobody important was watching? The meeting proceeded through financial reports, acquisition proposals, and market forecasts, but Victoria struggled to concentrate. Every few minutes, she found herself glancing toward Marcus at the head of the table. Throughout the discussions, he listened far more than he spoke. When he did offer an opinion, however, the entire room paid attention. His comments were thoughtful, precise, and remarkably respectful, even when he disagreed with someone. More than once, Victoria noticed him asking junior executives for their perspectives before sharing his own. By early afternoon, the board had completed the formal agenda. Evelyn Hayes closed her folder and looked around the room. "There is one final matter," she said. "Leadership appointments." The atmosphere immediately changed. Several executives straightened in their seats. Evelyn continued, "As everyone knows, Sterling Dynamics is entering a new phase of growth. We need leaders who can deliver results, but we also need leaders who embody the values upon which this company was built." She turned toward Marcus. "Marcus, would you like to address the board?" Marcus slowly stood. The room became completely silent. 32 years ago, he began, "I founded this company with a simple belief. Businesses succeed when people feel respected, valued, and seen." He paused. "Technology changes. Markets change. Strategies change. But character remains constant." Victoria lowered her eyes. Marcus continued, "This morning, before arriving here, I was reminded of something important. Titles can influence how people treat us, but they should never determine how we treat others." Several board members exchanged curious looks, unaware of what had happened on the flight. Marcus did not mention names. He did not describe the incident. Instead, he continued calmly. "Real leadership is revealed during ordinary moments. How we treat service workers, how we respond to inconvenience, how we speak to people who cannot advance our careers. Those moments reveal who we truly are." The words seemed directed at everyone, yet Victoria felt every sentence personally. Marcus looked around the room. "I have reviewed the promotion recommendations. While performance metrics matter, leadership requires more than ambition. It requires humility, empathy, and respect." Evelyn nodded in agreement. Marcus then surprised everyone. "Therefore, I recommend postponing all executive promotions for 90 days. During that period, I want a company-wide leadership initiative focused on culture, mentorship, and servant leadership." A few directors looked surprised, but none objected. Marcus smiled gently. "If we want exceptional organizations, we must first become exceptional human beings." After the meeting ended, executives slowly gathered their materials. Victoria remained seated, unable to leave. Finally, she approached Marcus privately. "Mr. Reed," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology, not because of your position, but because of how I treated you when I believed you were just another passenger." Marcus studied her for a moment, then smiled softly. "That realization is a good place to begin, Victoria." Marcus and Victoria stood alone in the nearly empty boardroom as the last executives left for the evening. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of Manhattan stretched across the skyline. Victoria took a deep breath. "I spent the entire flight thinking I understood people," she admitted quietly. "Today proved that I understood far less than I believed." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Most of us learn our most important lessons that way." Victoria looked genuinely remorseful. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I assumed things based on appearance, and I treated you unfairly because I believed there would be no consequences." Marcus folded his hands. "The difficult truth is that consequences are not always immediate. Sometimes they arrive years later. Sometimes they arrive in ways we never expect. But our character follows us everywhere." Victoria lowered her eyes. "I am ashamed of how I behaved." Marcus offered a small smile. "Shame can be useful if it leads to growth rather than defensiveness." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Marcus continued. "When I started this company, I worked out of a small apartment in Chicago. I attended meetings where people assumed I was the driver, the assistant, or the support staff. I learned early that many people make decisions about others before hearing a single word they have to say." Victoria looked surprised. "How did you deal with that?" Marcus smiled. "I focused on becoming the kind of leader I wished I had encountered." Those words remained with Victoria long after she left the boardroom. Over the following months, the leadership initiative Marcus introduced transformed the company culture. Senior executives participated in mentorship programs, spent time working alongside frontline employees, and attended workshops focused on empathy, communication, and servant leadership. To the surprise of many, Victoria volunteered for every program. She met regularly with junior employees, listened more than she spoke, and gradually earned a reputation very different from the one she had previously cultivated. 90 days later, when the board reconvened to reconsider leadership appointments, Evelyn Hayes addressed the room. "Growth is not measured by never making mistakes," she said. "It is measured by what we do after recognizing them." This time, Marcus supported Victoria's promotion. Not because she had delivered strong financial results, although she had. Not because she had influential allies, although she certainly did. He supported her because she had demonstrated humility, accountability, and a genuine willingness to change. Years later, Victoria often shared the story of that flight with new employees. She never mentioned titles or positions. Instead, she ended with the same lesson every time. Never decide someone's worth based on what you see in the first 30 seconds. The person standing quietly beside you may possess more wisdom, influence, and dignity than you can imagine. More importantly, every person deserves respect long before you know who they are. And in a company founded on that principle, those words became part of its culture for generations to come.